In this roundup of the week, it's all about the art of the deal. President Trump celebrates a major breakthrough in the Middle East, Boris Johnson stares into the abyss with the EU, and meanwhile COVID testing chaos sweeps the world. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. Welcome back to the interminable hostage negotiation that is 2020. I hope you're well and cutting yourself a sweet deal of some sort. The deal of the week has been the one brokered by the Trump administration between Israel and two of the Arab states, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. The countries will establish embassies and exchange ambassadors. They will formalise relations, working together on tourism and trade. For the first time, there have been direct flights between them. And Trump brought the various leaders together to sign the Abraham Accords. So there's been a certain amount of chatter about this, and as you might expect, it largely falls along partisan lines. As far as the pro-Trumpers are concerned, this is the most significant peace deal in our time. Indeed, Trump has brought peace to the Middle East, where everyone else has failed. Which is something of an overstatement, although it is genuinely a breakthrough achievement. As far as the anti-Trumpers are concerned, this is generally of very little interest. It's been remarkable how low a profile this event has received from the mainstream media. The right have, with some justice, it seems to me, been pointing out that had this been Obama's deal, it would have been front pages all round, Nobel Peace Prize guaranteed. And where they have talked about it, it's been in the spirit of, well, it's all right, I suppose. It's been interesting because the received wisdom has been that however he plays with his home base, Trump's foreign policy has been a disaster. The EU leaders roll their eyes and laugh at him. America's standing in the world has plummeted and its leadership position has evaporated, leaving China to hoover up the spoils. What this event forces you to do is to challenge that lazy assumption and realise that, whether intended or not, there has been an interesting dynamic at work here that people have been completely missing or at the very least underestimating. Before we talk about what that factor is, let's just review some of the headlines around his whole area. In his 4 years, Trump has made a number of significant moves that outraged or discomforted many seasoned observers. These include pulling America out of the Iran nuclear deal, and then added to that, taking out the Islamic Revolutionary Guard leader General Soleimani. A big shift from Obama's overtures to Iran towards a confrontational posture. Much dire retribution was predicted, and so far, that has not come to pass. Then there was the switch of the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Of the United Nations, 128 countries voted against it, including allies like the UK. An outraged Palestinian uprising was predicted and didn't come. Then there was Trump's willingness to have meetings with Kim Jong-un, totally against any kind of precedent. Again, disaster predicted. In fact, neither good nor evil really resulted from it, but certainly changed the dynamic and the roof didn't fall in. Then there was Trump pulling American troops out from many places in the world where they've been enmeshed in conflict, and pulling soldiers as well from Germany, which was also controversial and got many worried that the US would end up pulling out of NATO at some point, a sabre which has been rattled again this week. The US has been complaining that Europeans weren't paying more for their own defence for decades, well before Trump. It's a sort of complaint that used to be met by yawns in the past, certainly not action, whereas Trump's more robust approach has prompted at least some of them to begin to actually take action on it. And then going aggressively against China with a trade war and a focus on the theft of intellectual property. And then, of course, pulling out of the Paris Agreement to universal condemnation. The received wisdom has been that all these initiatives were the foreign policy equivalent of the bull in the china shop. Trump was just some dumb weirdo running around breaking stuff who just didn't understand the rules of how things worked. And you know, there's clearly some truth in that. One of the more credible tell-all memoirs about the Trump administration of the last few months has been John Bolton's book, the room where it happened. Bolton gives Trump credit where it's due, but he does talk about his capriciousness, how he would make a decision, then quickly change it back, and then maybe change it back again. He talked about how they were desperately trying to manage Trump's sudden urges to arrange meetings with various bad actors, whether it was Kim Jong-un, the Taliban, Putin, where they feared that because of his strange fascination for dictators, he would end up agreeing to something or giving something away that he didn't see any value in, but everyone else thought was absolutely vital to the country's interests. Bolton talked about how Trump's likes and dislikes affected how he dealt with people more than any sense of national strategic objectives. He liked Putin, he hated Angela Merkel, and you see the chaos he describes in the huge turnover of people in the administration, where people come in and then fall out of favour in relatively quick succession. Nevertheless, that's not the whole story. It may not even be the most important part of the story, although only time will tell us that. The one thing that a maverick figure like Trump does have the power to do is to challenge established frames. The latest Middle East deal is an absolute case in point. It has been received wisdom forever that there couldn't be peace in the Middle East unless it began with Israel coming to a settlement with the Palestinians. No Arab nation would deal with Israel until that was settled. And since the Palestinians refused every deal that was put in front of them, and maybe rightly, I'm not saying I'm an expert on any of that, then peace was always going to hover just out of reach. And then Trump put Jared Kushner on the case, and let's be clear, the scorn and the mockery at that point was savage. It was amateur hour, they said. New York Magazine ran a piece mocking him, saying Jared Kushner claims he can solve Israeli-Palestinian conflicts because he's read 25 books on it. And so on and so on. They portrayed him as ignorant and stupid, a boy thrust into the grown-up world of Middle East peacemaking. But it turns out that the thing that he and Trump did have going for them was a total lack of buy-in to the conventional wisdom. Kushner was speaking to people sufficiently to have picked up on the fact that other Arab nations were frustrated about the intransigence of the Palestinian leadership. So when he criticised the Palestinians, rather than making the huge gaffe that various people supposed, he was echoing the private views of a number of other important players in the game. And those players were already quietly cooperating with Israel in relation to their common enemy, which was, of course, Iran. Trump's uncompromising position on Iran and his likewise solid support for Israel, marked by offending the world community by moving the embassy, this actually gave a solid enough platform to completely reframe the problem. Not how to reconcile Israel and Palestine, first and foremost, rather how to normalise relations between Israel and other Arab countries, and then to use that to start a process with momentum that will lead other nations to join in. And then once that's happened, the pressure will increase on the Palestinians to come to an agreement, because the rest of the region will be moving on without them, rather than them being the essential piece of the puzzle that everyone else is dependent on. As you would expect, the Palestinian Liberation Organization could but vent its frustration, calling the signing ceremony a black day in the history of the people of Palestine. Is this individual deal the most significant peace deal ever? No, but it's nevertheless hugely significant and provides a vision for how the politics of a region can be transformed in a way that can be achieved. You can see how this would work, with people the way they are, not the way we'd like them to be, following the incentives that make sense to them. It could still all fall apart, but you can't just dismiss it as nothing. And when you review all those other things I was talking about, it's the same factor, the willingness to reframe problems, to challenge the received wisdom, to poke the bears and see which ones roar and which ones don't. I don't want to take this too far because, as I say, the chaotic management described by John Bolton in his book is credible and, very least, shows a process that has high volatility built in. But it's a fair question. Given our historical experience of the failure of appeasement, was it really wise for Obama and the Europeans to be sending cash to Iran on the basis that it would slightly slow their move towards nuclear weapons? Now, some have been known to say this is all part of the benefit of Trump. After all, they say he's famous for deal making. He wrote the book, after all. But when it comes to negotiation, there are different styles that are appropriate to different circumstances. According to Chris Voss, who was the FBI's lead international kidnapping negotiator and the author of the excellent book on negotiation, Never Split the Difference, which I highly recommend, by the way. According to Voss, Trump's style is one that he'd had to deal with often as a hostage negotiator, that of the assertive, openly aggressive negotiator. The sort that you had to deal with carefully so as not to make them mad. The problem with that style is that people get tired of dealing with them, he said. That's not such a problem if you're negotiating real estate deals, when the nature of the deal may be a one-off win-lose type negotiation. Negotiations between nations are part of an ongoing relationship, and seasoned hands are tending to look to uncover the win-win outcomes. So the question is, do you lose something if your approach is purely a transactional one rather than a relationship-built one? When Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan were forging a strong alliance, it was very much on the basis of a shared belief that nations committed to democracy, the rule of law and the free market should make the strongest possible alliance in the face of the alternative, communist Soviet Union. It was an alliance based on values as well as shared interests, and one which was always held to be more important than any single one transaction or issue. Arguably, those days were coming to an end before Trump anyway. But okay, these things have consequences. They may turn out to have the right consequences, but it's arguable that they weren't planned consequences. So, for example, as a result of Trump's antagonism towards them, the EU are, yes, they're looking at spending more on their own defence, which is a win for him, given that's what he was trying to achieve. But they also now reportedly view the United States as just another great power, like China or Russia, against which Europe should balance its interests. A couple of years ago, the Germans released a new US strategy calling for greater European strategic autonomy, reflecting the impression that the United States can no longer be a trusted ally. Plus, given Trump's willingness to simply pull out of international treaties, that the United States can no longer be assumed to be part of the consensus for rules-based governance. Reportedly, it was Trump's withdrawal from the Iran deal that was seen as really crossing the line. Europe's perception was that the deal was making the region safer, while Trump's approach is to bleed the Iranian economy dry and force change, presumably, preferably, regime change. And where we get left is that Europe seems to have decided to try to frustrate Trump's intent by finding ways for Iran to remain afloat economically, by establishing possibly even payment channels independent of the US, which would be quite a direct challenge. Trump isn't being totally out there or unique as identifying Iran as the source of a lot of state terror in the Middle East. Now, very likely it doesn't come to that. Angela Merkel isn't a fan of going that far, and so it probably won't happen. And many haven't given up just yet and are still hoping to revitalise the US-Europe relationship. And probably they're hoping that will happen by Trump losing the next election and them dealing with Biden instead. Key Democrats have highlighted their intent in that regard. Former Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte said, "It is very important for the next administration to focus on Europe." Whether that would be better for relations with the UK? That's another matter. This week, Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi were firing shots across Britain's bows because of the latest news concerning the post-Brexit negotiations, where Britain has threatened to scrap parts of the Brexit deal that affect Northern Ireland. "We can't allow the Good Friday Agreement that brought peace to Northern Ireland to become a casualty of Brexit," said Biden. "Any trade deal between the US and UK must be contingent upon respect for the agreement and preventing the return of a hard border, period." And this reflects a difficult reality for the Boris Johnson government. The Biden team and the Democrats generally widely perceive Boris Johnson to be Britain's Trump. And they pretty much see Brexit to be Britain's equivalent of Trump's southern border wall. Add to that a determination to work more closely with Europe post-Trump, then you can see that a Biden presidency might well be the death knell for any hope of that significant trade deal between the UK and the US. Now, it's possible that Biden and Johnson would eventually end up bonding over climate change, with the COP26 climate conference hosted by Britain towards the end of next year, an exercise that Johnson is said to be taking extremely seriously for all that COVID keeps getting in the way. While we're talking about Brexit, and note, I think this is the first time ever on this channel I've talked about Brexit, and while we're talking about deals, it's worth noting a couple of things. The recent fuss is reportedly, and there's always claim and counterclaim when these sort of things going on, reportedly because European negotiators have been playing hardball in trying to pressure Britain into giving up certain principles that it holds to be utterly essential. Right now, it seems 50-50 at most whether Britain and Europe will come to a deal at all, or whether we'll end up hitting the deadline with a no-deal outcome. And logically, that's exactly where we should be. I say that knowing that there would be a number of bad consequences if there were no deal. Nevertheless, it's still exactly where we should be. It's worth comparing this with where we were before, when there was a hung parliament and the former Prime Minister Theresa May was trying to negotiate a deal while MPs in Parliament were forcing their way into the picture every day. They voted to reject every potential deal that was put in front of them. They tried to vote to require the government to rule out a no-deal outcome, which was like a newborn lamb being sent in to negotiate a wolf. If one side in a negotiation knows the other side can't walk away from the table, they have zero incentive to give you anything. Which was why the Brexiteers looked at what May came back with and were clear about one thing: it was the worst of all possible worlds. Well, what a different world we're in now. Whether you voted to leave or to remain, and whether you think Johnson is a good guy or a raving idiot, the point is the UK got a much better agreement than people had thought possible once he had the majority and Parliament could no longer keep throwing spanners into the works. And if Britain was ever going to get a decent trade deal out of this, it was going to arrive at this moment. The deadline is approaching, and it's not at all clear whether it will be deal or no deal. Because that's how European deal-making is always done. Every EU summit has the same pattern. Fractious meetings going late into the night and through to the next morning before finally at the last second the agreement is struck. Now, that doesn't mean that there will definitely be a deal. Personalities are important and there are clashes here and things could go horribly wrong. But it was always going to come to this. If we had comfort in the process, it would have been because we'd given up before we even began. And in some ways, this is the lesson of the Trump approach to deal-making as well. Conflict, not comfort, precedes change. If you can't deal with that, you will lose to those who can, if we're in a world where the deals are transactional and win-lose, which seems to be where we are. Ironically, Boris Johnson was elected because he promised to get Brexit done, and he made a huge positive impression in the early days because they seemed to have a solid grasp of what they were doing, which when it comes to Brexit still seems to be the case, even as they're coming across to the population generally as being completely out of their depth when it comes to the coronavirus crisis. Still, at least they're not the only ones. And the one place that no deal seems in sight at all this side of November is the US government, where Democrats and Republicans are completely incapable of coming close to an agreement on a second coronavirus relief deal. I may have mentioned it once or twice, but there's an election coming, and as a result, party advantage takes precedence over actually helping people, at least that's how it looks. The Democrats want a huge slug of cash to go out. Senate Republicans want to restrict it to just $650 billion. So instead it's going to be zero, at least until the election, when the victors will hope to take credit for what then gets done rather than blame for it taking so long. And this matters because while case rates in America are slowly declining, thankfully, and death rates are also slowly declining, albeit at quite a high rate, nevertheless, the hardship caused by the impact of the economy is likely to ramp up over the coming months. Probably nothing quite like Victoria, Australia, mind, which has the distinction in recent weeks of having done the most stringent, and some are saying authoritarian, lockdown anywhere in the world outside of China. At the beginning of August, Daniel Andrews, Premier of Victoria, declared the main city Melbourne to be in a state of disaster, at the same time as it already being in a state of emergency. Presumably, if it gets really bad, it'll be declared to be in a state of disastrous emergency, or something. In any case, the declaration shut all non-essential workplaces. People have to stay within 5 kilometres of their home. There's an 8 p.m. curfew and you can be fined $1,652 for being out after then without good reason, which you need a permit to prove. Only one household member can go shopping once per day. The lower house of the Victorian Parliament has been shut down, not moved to Zoom, but just shut down. Democratic oversight is transmission vector for the virus, apparently. Police can come to your home and arrest you if they suspect that you're organising democratic protests. That doesn't seem to be stopping everybody, as 70 people were arrested last weekend for protesting the lockdown in Melbourne out of an estimated 250 people that attended. Andrews said it's not smart, it's not right, it's not the time for protest. No one has the right to make choices like that potentially puts at risk everything we are working towards. Now that may sound reasonable in a time of genuine crisis, but kind of identical to what any authoritarian would say, using any manufactured crisis they could get. Yesterday there were 42 new cases and 5 new deaths in Victoria. All of the deaths are linked to known outbreaks in care homes. Does that qualify as a state of catastrophic emergency disaster? You're not allowed to protest and Parliament's been cancelled, so only journalists can ask the question, and mostly they're not. According to the Institute of Public Affairs, an additional 300,000 jobs will be lost as a result of the current lockdown, added to the 168,000 who have lost them already. Andrews has admitted the curfew is not based on medical advice and claimed it was introduced to make it easier for police to enforce stay-at-home measures. If you want to go out and be unlawful, now police have got the easiest set of arrangements they have ever had to catch you and fine you. And with so many more ways to be unlawful, that's probably just as well. The catchy slogan apparently is "Staying apart keeps us together," which is as close to Orwell's "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength" as you are likely to find. Hard to believe it's the nation that gave us Crocodile Dundee.
Have you ever protested anything?
Sure, every time I get thrown out of the pub.
Elsewhere, lockdowns are also being reimposed. Within the UK, we're now a couple of weeks into the rule of 6, meaning that only 6 people can congregate together. But the real COVID story of the moment comes under the heading of testing chaos. In the UK, there is testing chaos as the coronavirus testing regime falls further and further behind, with more and more people unable to get tests or having to wait for a long time for the results of tests. There have been instances of hundreds of people queuing outside walk-in testing centres, and people have been told now not to get a test if they don't have symptoms. In Europe, there is testing chaos. Free tests in Germany had to be reined in as laboratories couldn't cope with demand, and a data error in Bavaria led to 1,000 people who had positive tests not being told about them. France is also struggling to keep up with demand. And across the United States, there is testing chaos. Sites overwhelmed by demand, equipment shortages, queues of hundreds of people, and so on and so on. You get the general idea. I'll make just one overall observation. In all of these locations, I bet there are politicians slamming the chaos and holding it to be uniquely down to the incompetence of the named elected person in charge. But since it's happening everywhere, what can we really deduce from that? And there's not a single cause, like a worldwide shortage of one key ingredient or something. So the real lesson, it seems to me, and correct me if you think I'm wrong, is that governments are really not good at projects that push to scale. They're not efficient. They're not good at logistics. Government is just bad at making things happen quickly. So that's something to bear in mind when somebody says to you that the answer to a big problem is a huge, centrally coordinated government programme. Always, and I mean always, imagine what that programme will look like if it's badly run, if it's carried out inefficiently and with minimal responsiveness to changes as you go. If it would still work in the face of all those problems, and that's true, you're not just kidding yourself, then cool, maybe it'll work. If that's not the case, maybe you have to look at a different approach. All right, time for a couple of quick things I noticed this week. This item from CNN gets my prize for the dumbest headline of the week. The pandemic didn't solve climate change. This week's disasters are proof. If you thought COVID-19 restrictions like enforced lockdowns and social distancing would put a lasting dent in our collective carbon footprint and save the world from warming, you were mistaken. And then he quotes melting ice sheets, which strangely enough didn't stop melting because of COVID-19, and the wildfires that we discussed in this week's other video. And my response is, really, CNN? Which are the people who were saying that if only people would stay home for a few months, then magically the ice will stop melting, the temperatures will fall, the bluebirds will be singing in the trees, and the happy children playing in the streets? And the answer, of course, is nobody was saying that. Articles like that are why people begin to get a trifle sceptical with the side that goes around saying the science is real, while apparently not having much of a clue what the science actually is. Sometimes that's something that even the BBC has been accused of. A couple of weeks ago I mentioned that the new Director General of the BBC had promised to fix the BBC's impartiality problem. This week they launched the latest annual report, which is full of some pretty plain speaking about how much it has been failing. There has been a slump in people watching the BBC in the North and the Midlands, which is the heart of Brexit Britain. The corporation's relative fixation with talking about diversity doesn't seem to be hitting the mark, as working class households, younger people and ethnic minority communities are all switching off in greater numbers, and who say that the BBC does not represent people like them. So the BBC's heard the challenge. Whether they can rise to it, we shall have to see. Now, unlike the BBC, who force people with the power of the law to pay for them via the licence fee, this channel does not enjoy the unlimited funds from a captive audience. So I'm hugely grateful as always to the wonderful people who support this channel via Patreon. Your support enables me to continue making videos, some of them research heavy and time consuming, some of them a bit controversial, not able to be monetized via YouTube. All of those are no problem, thanks to you. If you value the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content I aim to provide on this channel, please consider adding your support at patreon.com/Mallen Baker. The more support there is, the more time can go into these videos, the more and better they will become. At least that's the plan. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.